want to talk about some good news about clean energy. I was an early entrant at Shimer College, 69 to 71. I've had a career in the clean energy world. Yes, there is hope for a clean energy future, at least for electricity. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about myself and Shimer College, a couple of minutes about my publications and books, about 20 minutes about clean energy, and that should leave some time for discussion at the end. I was an early entrant in 1969. I arrived in Mount Carroll as a 16-year-old, a refugee from 11th grade. I thought I knew everything. I found out by the end of placement exams that I knew a little bit about American history and a little bit about music. I spent 4 semesters in Mount Carroll, took a year off, went to 48 states in a VW Bug, and moved to Bellingham, Washington in December of 72 to study environmental economics. I've been in Olympia, Washington since 1977. Had a career in electric utility regulation and rate making since 1982. This is a lecture series from authors who went to Shimer College. So I'm going to start with a definition of book because not everybody recognizes a book to be what it used to be. I'm going to use an old-fashioned definition, a paper publication that can stand on its own on the shelf and that you can read the title on the spine. If you went to Shimer, you probably have a pretty good idea what I'm talking about when I say book. By that definition, I have 4 books. Electricity Regulation in the US, a guide, which is used as a text in a number of colleges and universities, and as a handbook for utility regulators throughout the United States, and indeed an introduction to the power system for readers around the world. 3 others are on much more technical topics of electricity rate making, the last of which, the big book on the left, my final work, Electric Cost Allocation for a New Era, is very important, but targeted at a global audience of about 500 readers, people who do the rate studies for electric utilities. I also have a couple of dozen smaller publications, some of which were printed on paper and some of which are electronic only. You can download all of my publications from raponline.org. RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project, is a global nonprofit that works with utility regulators and policymakers in the transition to a clean energy economy. I want to take a minute to thank Eileen Buchanan. I had Eileen for my Humanities 2 class. I hated that class. I had to read fiction. I didn't like to read fiction. I still don't like to read fiction. I had to write papers every week on what I had written, what I had read, and I had to go through a process first with my tutor and then with Eileen to turn my words into sentences, my sentences into paragraphs, and ultimately my paragraphs into comprehensive thoughts. Without that class, I could not have had the success expressing myself in the written word that I've had in my career. So now let's turn to the bright new future of clean energy. I spent most of my career wishing and hoping that wind and solar power would become cost effective and take over the electric power industry. And finally, in the last 5 or so years, it's begun to happen. Wind costs dropped precipitously. It really, starting in the 1980s. I'm going to use cents per kilowatt hour as my unit of measurement. And what I say, most US electricity consumers pay about 15 cents per kilowatt hour, and most households use about 1,000 kilowatt hours a month for a monthly electric bill of about $150. Of that bill, about half is the cost of power and about half is the cost of getting it to the distribution system. So the average is about 7.5 cents for the cost of power. New wind is costing about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour, substantially less than the average cost of existing coal, natural gas, and nuclear power. Solar costs are declining decades ahead of forecasts. These dotted lines show forecasts from the International Energy Agency and others for what would happen to solar costs, predicting that they would come down. But the most optimistic prediction was that they would cost under a dime a kilowatt hour by 2025. In fact, they crossed that line in 2015 and are now down in the nickel a kilowatt hour range, substantially less than the average cost of our existing power system. New wind and solar cost no more than the operating costs for existing power plants. Here on the left, I have the operating costs, that is the fuel and maintenance costs, none of the capital, just fuel and maintenance, for coal, gas, and nuclear from national average data, between 2.5 and 4 cents a kilowatt hour. A few years ago, Xcel Energy in Colorado sought bids for new solar and wind projects. The solar bids were under 3 cents a kilowatt hour, the wind bids under 2 cents. That is new wind and solar for less than the operating cost of existing power plants. The politics are really good. Democrats overwhelmingly back solar energy. Independents overwhelmingly back solar energy. Republicans tend to be all of the above supporters: wind, solar, nuclear, even fossil fuels. But 75% support solar as at least part of the answer to our future energy needs. So the politics of clean energy are really pretty terrific. And another great piece of news is that battery costs have been declining. In the last decade, battery costs have dropped by about a factor of 5. These are utility scale and vehicle scale battery packs. The darker blue is the cost of the batteries themselves. The lighter blue is the additional cost for the assemblies that connect them together and make them useful. And there are new battery technologies that are in deployment, not in the labs, but actually being built for utilities that promise to drop these costs even more. Yes, there are some material supply issues for automobile batteries, lithium-ion batteries, which are both very powerful and very light. But for utility scale batteries, there are other technologies that don't rely on scarce materials. And for the power sector, at least, those are more likely to be the bigger part of our future. We have a lot of wind and solar in development. On the left here is the existing capacity of our power system, and it totals about 1,200 gigawatts. A gigawatt is a billion watts. The total power system in the US is about 1,200 gigawatts. One large nuclear plant is about 1 gigawatt, to give some sense of that. 2 coal plants make a gigawatt. Of the 1,200, about half is natural gas, and only a fourth is renewable energy, wind, solar, and hydro. But that's changing. Here on the right is the interconnection queue. The power plants that are proposed for construction or in construction, which have applied for and done the paperwork, and in many cases made financial commitments to connect to the transmission system, with the power to it. First of all, the amount of clean energy that's in the queue is more than the total amount of power generation capacity we have today. Nearly all of that is wind, solar, and then wind, solar hybrids or batteries. That is clean energy. Only a very, very small percentage is new natural gas or other power sources. This could all be in place within 5 years. This is the interconnection queue. These are projects that are ready to go. What about nuclear? Uh, Nuclear is a significant part of our existing power system. About 18% of our electricity comes from nuclear. For new power sources, it's simply too expensive. This is a cost comparison from Lazar, a major investment brokerage. And they are, I guess, cousins of mine, the French branch of the family. My father's family came from Romania. Nuclear costs 13 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour for new power plants, according to Lazard. The number on the left of $29, 2.9 cents a kilowatt hour is the operating costs of existing units. And I think the existing nuclear plant should continue to operate for at least some years to come. But compared to 13 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour, new wind and solar is in the 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour range. Same analytical techniques, unsubsidized analysis, no consideration of tax incentives, tax credits, or other gimmicks. This is the real cost. Nuclear simply can't compete on cost. But a system that's all solar will not keep the lights on. So even though it's cheap, here the red line is the usage across the 24 hours of the day in July in Texas. And the blue line is the output of a solar farm large enough to serve all of the kilowatt hours used during the day. But as you can see, it would produce way too much power during the daytime and essentially none at all at night. That wouldn't keep the lights on by itself. Now, if you had a system that was all wind, that would not keep the lights. Texas has two different wind production areas, South Texas and West Texas. This, again, the red line is the usage across the day, from midnight to midnight. The yellow line is the output of a wind farm that was large enough to provide all of the kilowatt hours. That would produce too many kilowatt hours in the early evening and not nearly enough in the middle of the day. Well, you might have an idea here about some of each. So if we take a mix of solar and multiple wind sites, in this case, I've taken 1/3 each solar, West Texas wind, and South Texas wind. And if we get that kind of a portfolio, the blue line, the renewable energy line, actually follows the customer needs quite closely across the hours of the day. So a little too much in the early evening and not enough late at night. So we would need some flexibility. That could be flexible load, things that we turn off in the late evening and run during days when there's surplus power, or it could be batteries to store power that we produce when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining and save it for when it's not. So let's talk about flexible load first. A lot of the things that we use electricity for, like for computers that we're using to watch this presentation, we pretty much need them when we need them. And that's not going to be very flexible. But they don't use a lot of electricity. Some of our things that use a lot of electricity are quite flexible. Electric car charging, water heaters, and ice storage air conditioning. So let's talk about these. Electric car charging, typical electric car, only needs to be charged once or twice a week. Cars are parked 22 to 23 hours a day. They're only operated typically 1 to 2 hours a day. Nearly all of the time, we can charge our cars when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing and the power is cheap, and drive them whenever we want to. Once in a while, we'll have to charge them urgently. We're on a long road trip. We'll pull into a fast charger at a Walmart and plug in for half an hour to recharge so we can drive another 200 miles. But for myself, with my electric car, there's only been a few times in 4 years when we would have needed that. So car charging is very flexible. The next is water heaters. Water heaters use a lot of electricity. In fact, the average electric water heater uses as much power as the average electric car driving about 12,000 miles a year. The water heater is a battery, a hot water battery. They only need to run 2 or 3 hours a day to make all the hot water we use during the day. And they store pretty much a day's worth of hot water, which means we can heat our water when the sun is shining, the wind is blowing, and the power is cheap and clean. And we can take showers and do laundry and wash dishes whenever we need to. We just need slightly smarter water heaters that pay attention to when the power is cheap and store water, hot water for us for when we need it. The third is one you're probably not familiar with, ice storage air conditioning. The technology is really no more sophisticated than a pile of ice and a fan. That you make ice when the power is cheap and you cool buildings when the air is hot. Here's what it looks like in practice in a high-rise office building in New York City. System takes up a few parking spaces in the basement and stores enough cool to cool the building through a very hot afternoon and early evening. Make the ice overnight. The air outside is cooler and the chilling system makes ice, works better, and then use it the next day during the hot hours. Well, that's flexible load. The next is electricity storage, that is actually storing kilowatt hours. And there are three ways that this is mostly done or likely to be done in the future: hydroelectric dams and pump storage systems, batteries of various kinds. And then there's some new technologies coming along. I'll talk a little bit about gravity storage. It's not here yet, but it's actually pretty simple and will work. The question is whether it will be cheap enough. So let's start with pumped storage. This is a two-lake system in Michigan, an upper reservoir and a lower reservoir. Two lakes. When power is cheap, water is pumped uphill. When power is expensive, they let it back down again and make electricity. So it consumes power going up, it produces power coming down. You get back about 80% of what you put in. So you have to use cheap power to pump water uphill and then only let it down when power is more valuable. Most of the pump storage systems in the US were built go along with nuclear plants. Nuclear plants produce power all day and all night, and we don't use power at a uniform rate. But they're also very, very easy to adapt to work with wind and solar, where the power comes some of the time and doesn't come some of the time. Batteries of various kinds are increasingly cost effective. This is a large battery system that Tesla built in Australia. They built it at the site of a wind farm. When the wind is blowing, the battery is charged. When the wind doesn't blow, the batteries can supply power to the grid through the same grid connection that the wind farm uses when it's operating. And this system has helped keep the lights on in South Australia, which was having a pretty severe power shortage when it was built. And then I mentioned gravity storage. Literally, this company is building a plant that's a giant pile of concrete blocks and a set of cranes that pulls them up when the wind is blowing and the power is cheap, and lets them back down again when the power is expensive. When they go up, they require power to run the motors, to hoist them up. When they come back down again, they generate electricity through the same motors, running backwards as a generator. And there's several different approaches to this. One is a train full of rocks that you run up a mountain and let back down again. One is a pile of concrete blocks. There are lots of other approaches to energy storage that are being tested. Some of them will work. Some of them will be economic. Some of them will not. but the investment we're making in research and development will pay off. So now I want to take you on a tour of your new home. I'm going to skip over a few of the details here, but you're going to live in a newer home in the future, and it's going to be quite different. First, it's going to have very efficient building shell. The walls, the ceilings, the windows will be made with very good insulating properties. It will have high efficiency heat pumps with air exchangers in each room so that you can control the temperature in each room separately. Only heat the rooms you need to heat, only cool the rooms you need to cool. That will use a bunch of power. We'll also have an ice storage system to support the air conditioning on hot days so that you don't have to use electricity when it's expensive to produce your cooling for the house. And that ice storage system, when it's running, will consume a bunch of power. I have a smart thermostat to control the heating and cooling system. I have electric cars hooked up in the garage. And when those are charging, they will consume a bunch of power. They'll have a grid integrated heat pump water heater, high efficiency water heater, much more efficient than a gas water heater that can make hot water when the power is cheap, sun is shining, the wind is blowing, and deliver hot water to your shower, your dishwasher, your laundry equipment whenever you need it. And when it's running, it'll consume a bunch of power. There'll be various other smart appliances. Your laundry equipment, refrigerator, dishwasher will have some smart features to them to give them some ability to respond to hours when electricity is expensive and hours when it's cheap. And those appliances, when they're running, will consume a bunch of power. Now, if all of those things, the space conditioning, the electric vehicle, the water heat, the major appliances, and the lights and minor appliances, were all running at the same time, they would add up to a lot. 22 kilowatts is about 20 times the average across a month usage of a house. But they don't all run at the same time. And because we can control the electric vehicle, the water heat, the major appliances, and we can precondition spaces, warm them or cool them in advance of need, if the need will be during a high cost period. We can actually limit that to about 15% of that usage during the high demand hours. And the nice thing about getting it down below 6 kW is that can be covered by the batteries in our electric vehicles, connected to the house and running backwards sometimes, storing power when it's cheap, delivering it back to the house when the power is expensive. All of that flexibility dramatically cuts our peak demand, saves us money, and allows us to run the whole power system on wind, solar, and water. I think you're going to like your new house. It'll be comfortable, it'll be economical, it'll work well for you. We're really coming up on a wonderful new opportunity. Wind, solar, batteries, and electric vehicles and other uses of electricity that we haven't had much of. If you really want to read one piece of my work, go to Rap Online and download Teaching the Duck to Fly. This is a publication where I talk about adapting the power system to a high level of wind and solar, reshaping our electricity use so that we can operate our whole economy reliably, economically, and environmentally on wind, solar, and other renewable energy resources. And with that, I'll stop and try and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you. And for this recording, there will not be a question period.